So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Valerie and then turn my mute on in case there's any background noise on my end. Um, so it's good to see you guys today. Um, Valerie has let's see, this year would be a decade with extension, and before that was a graduate student under Bill Johnson, and then went over to Illinois for a little while. But we consider her to be the weed specialist of Southern Indiana. So we thought with the program today, why not talk about weed control? And she farms in southern Knox County with her husband, Paul, raise some pigs and whatnot. So with that, Valerie's a co-host for these next 4 sessions. You'll be seeing both of us if you attend the sessions, and I'll let Valerie take it away.
Thanks so much, Hans. I appreciate it. I'm really impressed how much you remember. I don't know if that's scary or good thing, but so anyway, I figured I would start off because I know some of you guys attended the PART program, and so there hasn't been a ton of updates since then, and so I was wanting to spice it up a little bit. And Bill and one of his research associates actually made a nice little video talking about herbicide-resistant traits in soybeans that we're seeing, and he's going to talk about kind of use guidelines for those herbicides that are enabled. And so I'm going to play this video first. It's around 20 minutes or so. And then I'll pick up at the end and I'll talk about identifying some herbicide injury on soybeans a little bit, and then kind of towards the end then, because again, I have a bad feeling we're going to see more, obviously soybean injury as we get more traits. And again, that record keeping, everything is going to be really important as we go into adopting all these new technologies in soybeans. But, again, they're going to be useful tools also, especially in those fields that just have really tough to control weeds. So anyway, I'm going to play this video. I'm going to share my sound and share the screen, and we'll play this video. Let me make sure my sound's turned up here. That way you guys can see or hear it hopefully pretty well. Hans, shout at me. Man, oh man, I can't talk tonight. It's past my bedtime apparently. Shout at me if you can't hear anything. And we'll get this show on the road. Let's see.
Hi, my name is Marcelo Zimmer, and I am a Weed Science Program Specialist at Purdue University. Today I'll be talking about the herbicide-resistant traits available for soybean production here in Indiana and some of the use guidelines for using the herbicides that are enabled in these different technologies. This presentation is going to be fairly simple. We just want to provide a quick overview of these different technologies so farmers can make a decision about which soybean trait is going to be the most useful for their particular situation. The first thing that we have to acknowledge when we talk about the different soybean traits technologies available for us is that the industry only developed these technologies because of the major issues that we face with herbicide resistance, not only in Indiana, but on all soybean producing areas in the country. This table here summarizes all the different weed species that we were able to identify that have developed resistance to a certain herbicide mode of action here in Indiana. As you can see, we have 4 different weed species that have developed resistance to the photosystem 2 inhibitor herbicides or the group 5 herbicides. Those are herbicides such as atrazine and metribuzin, for example. We also were able to identify several different weed species that have developed resistance to the ALS inhibitor herbicides or group 2. Those are herbicides like First Rate, Canopy, Classic, Pursue, and Scepter, for example. We also have tall water hemp and Palmer amaranth that have developed resistance to the PPO inhibitor herbicides or group 14. Those are herbicides like Flexer and Cobra. And we have 5 different weed species that have developed resistance to glyphosate in Indiana. And this is such a major issue for us because we rely on glyphosate a lot for our post-emergence control of weeds in both corn and soybeans. However, our biggest issue are those weeds that have developed resistance to multiple herbicides modes of action within the same population. In Indiana, we're able to identify 4 different weed species that have developed resistance to both glyphosate and ALS inhibitor herbicides within the same fields, such as giant ragweed, mare's tail, tall water hemp, and palmer amaranth. We're also able to identify populations of tall water hemp and palmer amaranth with resistance to the ALS herbicides, glyphosate, and also the PPO herbicides, all within the same fields. So if you have these populations, they're highlighted in the square right here, you have very limited options for post-emergence control of weeds in soybean production, especially if you're growing traits like non-GMO soybeans or glyphosate-tolerant soybeans. This next table here is adapted from the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension Service, and it basically summarizes all the different soybean herbicide tolerance traits that we have available for production in the United States. It also shows us the different herbicides that are enabled in each one of these soybean technologies. So as you can see here, we have conventional non-GMO soybeans. None of these herbicides are enabled in this soybean trait, except that you could still use the ALS inhibitor herbicides, but you would have a high risk of soybean injury when using these herbicides. We also have the STS and bold soybeans, which are still considered non-GMO soybeans because of the soybean breeding technique that was used to obtain these varieties. And the difference here is that they have an increased tolerance to the ALS inhibitor herbicides, so you can use those herbicides with a lower risk of herbicide injury. Now moving on to the GMO soybean traits, we have Liberty Link, which allows for applications of Liberty post-emergence, or other glufosinate herbicides are also allowed. We also have the Roundup Ready and Roundup Ready 2 yield. Both of these traits come for resistance to glyphosate or Roundup herbicide. And for a couple of years now, we have the approval of Xtend soybeans, which allow for application of either glyphosate or dicamba products post-emergence. The only dicamba formulations approved for use in Xtend soybeans are herbicides such as Xtendimax, Tavium, and Ingenia. We also have Xtend Flex that was approved late last year in September, which allows for application of either glyphosate, glufosinate, or also one of those dicamba products that I just listed. And for a couple of years now, we also been able to grow the Enlist soybeans, which have tolerance to glyphosate, glufosinate, and 2,4-D choline. 2,4-D choline products are products such as Enlist 1 and Enlist Duo. You cannot use any of the generic 2,4-D formulations in Enlist crops. You have to use the low volatility 2,4-D choline formulation. We also have the GT27 soybeans, which have tolerance to glyphosate, and also they have tolerance to isoxaflutol, which is an HPPD herbicide. So you can use isoxaflutol as a pre-emergence herbicide in this particular soybean trait. The only formulation of isoxaflutol that is labeled for HPPD for this GT27 soybeans is known as Elite 27. And very similarly, we also have the LLGT27 soybeans, which have tolerance to glyphosate, glufosinate, and also isoxaflutol as a pre. And finally, we also have the MGI soybeans, which do not have tolerance to glyphosate, so that's kind of one of the cons of this technology. But we have tolerance to glufosinate and also have tolerance to isoxaflutol as a pre, and also mesotrione or mesotrione as a post application as well. Now I want to go over each one of those soybean traits that we discussed in the previous table and give you guys some of the pros and cons of each one of these technologies so you can make an informed decision of which one of those traits is the best fit for your particular situation. I'm going to start off with non-GMO conventional soybeans. Some of the pros of this technology is that you can acquire seeds, can buy seeds at a fairly low seed cost. You can also, in many cases, save the seeds, so you have a seed saving advantage. Many varieties are not protected by intellectual property laws, so you're allowed to save seeds for the next season. And also, a few companies out there are paying seed premiums, so you can get about $1 extra per bushel if you're growing non-GMO soybeans, because those companies are trying to sell their products in some specific markets where they only allow non-GMO soybeans. Some of the cons of growing non-GMO soybeans is that you have no post-herbicide options for weeds with multiple herbicide resistance. So if you have weeds with ALS or PPO resistance, you have no post-emergence herbicide that's going to be effective on those weeds. There are only a few areas on the state that we can say that farmers can still get away with growing non-GMO soybeans, but it's still possible in some areas. We're also going to have more susceptibility to herbicide drift, herbicide carryover, or tank contamination. Again, if you're spraying glyphosate, 2,4-D, or dicamba on nearby fields, you are susceptible to herbicide drift from those herbicides because your soybeans do not have tolerance to these traits, to these herbicides. For the Roundup Ready soybeans, now I'm talking the Roundup Ready first generation and also the Roundup Ready 2 yield. Some of the pros of this technology is that you can acquire seeds at a fairly low seed cost as well, because this technology has been in the market for quite a while now. And also it allows you to still spray glyphosate, which is still effective on many broadleaf weeds and grasses. However, at the same time, this is one of the cons because most of the problematic broadleaf weeds that we have to deal with already have resistance to glyphosate. So again, just like the non-GMO soybeans, there's only a few areas in the state where herbicide resistance is still not that much of a problem, and you can get away with growing either non-GMO soybeans or just a Roundup Ready soybean. For the Liberty Link soybean trait, some of the pros of this technology is that we don't have resistance to glufosinate or Liberty in the Midwest, or at least not yet. But we know that if we keep using the same active ingredient over and over again, we're likely to develop herbicide resistance eventually, so we gotta keep that in mind. Another advantage of Liberty Link is that glufosinate has a low potential for off-target movement injury to neighboring crops because it takes a decent amount of glufosinate to actually cause significant injury. Usually, neighboring crops are more sensitive to herbicides like 2,4-D, dicamba, or glyphosate than they would be to glufosinate, and that's why off-target movement is not as much of a concern for Liberty as it is to other opposed herbicides. Some of the cons of this technology, one of them being that glufosinate can be very weak on grasses depending on weed size and density. It also requires good weather and appropriate herbicide coverage for good activity. Also, you want to make sure you spray small weeds. Spray those plants when they're small, because contact herbicides such as glufosinate are not as forgiving when it comes to weed size as some of the synthetic herbicides like dioxins or glyphosate, for example. Another disadvantage of this technology is that we cannot use glyphosate for post-emergence control of grasses, so we're limited to using Liberty or some of the ACCA's herbicides. And again, Liberty is kind of weak on grasses, so that might be detrimental for your weed control. Also, with Liberty, we can only use glufosinate as our post-emergence herbicide for broadleaf weeds, so we can't have over-reliance on a single effective mode of action for post-weed control, and like I said, that can lead to herbicide resistance development in the long term. Now for the Extend and Extend Flex soybeans, I'm going to talk about these within the same slides because they're very similar, with the exception that for Extend Flex, we can also spray glufosinate as a post-emergence herbicide. So some of the pros of this technology is that we can keep glyphosate as an option, while also we have the high efficacy of dicamba as an advantage to use on most glyphosate-resistant broadleaf weeds. With the Extend Flex, we also have more flexibility for post applications because we can either spray a dicamba formulation or we can also spray glufosinate if we decide to do so. Some of the disadvantages of this technology are in regards to drift management and application restrictions. There are several restrictions in place concerning wind speed, time application time of day, cutoff date, crop growth stage, and buffers. I'm not gonna give too much information on these application restrictions because it will take an entire presentation just to go over those restrictions. There's also risk for herbicide resistance development, especially with the extend soybeans, because again, we only spray one effective mode of action over those glyphosate resistant broadleaf weeds. In the case of extend flex, at least we have two effective mode of actions that we can choose from for our post-emergence control of those glyphosate resistant weeds. Also, one thing that we gotta keep in mind is that herbicides like dicamba can antagonize the activity of glyphosate or other ACC or graminicide herbicides like the ACCases for the control of grassy weeds and also volunteer corn. And that's a factor of both application technology because we're using larger droplets and also because of the herbicide antagonism of dicamba with those graminicides. Also, we had a few problems with velvet leaf scapes. Dicamba is not a strong herbicide for velvet leaf, so some farmers growing extend soybeans have had some problems with velvet leaf scapes. Now for the Enlist E3 soybean trait, some of the advantages of this technology is that we can keep glyphosate as one of our options for post-emergence control of weeds. We also have the flexibility of using either 2,4-D-choline or glufosinate for our post-emergence application to control those glyphosate-resistant weeds. So we can either use each one of those products separately, or we can tank mix them. These products tank mix very well, and that's a great approach to prevent herbicide resistance evolution by using two effective modes of action in a single application. We also have less restrictive buffers with Enlist applications to Enlist soybeans than we have for applications of dicamba products on extend soybeans. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You gotta make your buffer calculation and see, depending on the size and shape of your field, how much area of your field you won't be able to spray by using each one of these technologies. Some of the disadvantages of the Enlist is that even though those application restrictions are less restrictive than for the extend soybeans, you still have to do some drift management. You still have to respect wind speeds and buffers according to the label. So still there's some restrictions out there compared to other soybean traits. We also have some instances of poor control of grassy weeds in volunteer corn, and that's caused by the antagonistic effects of 2,4-D on the grass activity of herbicides like glyphosate or the ACCase herbicides like clethodim or Assure 2, for example. And finally, we also have some instances of tank incompatibility with the potassium salt of glyphosate when we tank mix that with Enlist 1 with low water volumes. So if you're using Enlist 1 and you're tank mixing that with a potassium salt of glyphosate, you want to make sure you mix each product truly and slowly, and you use a decent amount of water when making those tank mixes. So for the LLGT27 technology, some of the pros of this soybean trait is that at the same time we have tolerance to glufosinate or Liberty products, but we still can keep glyphosate as an option as well. We can actually tank mix glyphosate and glufosinate, which can be useful depending on your weed spectrum. It's not necessarily a good idea if you have a lot of grasses because the glufosinate is going to antagonize glyphosate activity on those grasses. And you can also use isoxaflutol as a pre-herbicide, and the only formulation labeled so far is Li-27. That's the only herbicide with isoxaflutol that you can use on those soybeans so far. It also has less sensitivity to mesotrione carryover. So if you had used Callisto, for example, in the previous year on corn, you have less chance of having herbicide carryover, but you cannot use Callisto for this soybean trait within the same growing season, even though it has less sensitivity. One of the cons of this technology, again, is that you're going to have heavy reliance on the HPPDs for both corn and soybeans. We already use a lot of HPPDs on corn, so if you start using HPPDs on soybeans as well, it may result in a short shelf life of this soybean trait. So that's something to keep in mind. We also have the MGI soybeans. I'm not sure how much of those soybeans will get planted in this growing season. They have tolerance to mesotrione that can be used as a post. We can also use isoxaflutol as a pre-herbicide, and it also has tolerance to glufosinate or Liberty as well. So we have three different herbicide active ingredients here that we can use, but two of them are HPPD herbicides. So again, it's one of the cons of this technology is that we're gonna have heavy reliance on the HPPD herbicides for both the corn ear and the soybean ear, and that may result in a short shelf life of this technology as well. Another con of this technology is that glyphosate is not an option, so we do not have a glyphosate tolerance trait in this soybean, so you cannot use glyphosate for MGI soybeans. So this table here in this slide kind of summarizes what I just talked about over this entire presentation. It shows you the different traits that you have for either one of those soybean technologies, the herbicides that are enabled for each one of those technologies, some of the benefits and risks of each one of those traits. I'm not going to go over this table, but you can pause the video and look at some of those comments as well, so you can make up your decision about which soybean trait is going to be the best fit for your particular field. So when it comes to weed management strategies, soybean traits is just one part of the equation. You also got to keep in mind that using residual herbicides will provide the greatest value to weed management because they're going to reduce the pressure on those post-emergence herbicides. Again, all the soybean traits that we saw in this presentation, they provide tolerance to a post-emergence herbicide, but that's kind of your last resource. So you want to start by reducing the pressure on those post-emergence herbicides by using cover crops, by using residual herbicides as well, so you have less weed emergence and you have less selection pressure on those post-emergence herbicides. You also want to apply all these herbicides in a manner that optimizes their efficacy, even if you already have herbicide-resistant weeds in this particular field. So you want to use a full rate of those herbicides, either pre or post, and you also want to apply those post herbicides to small weeds. Spray auxins especially very early. It's better to spray a second time for another flush of weeds than use a rescue treatment for those weeds that didn't die in the first pass, because usually a rescue treatment is not going to be effective on those weeds because they're already injured. They're not going to have as much leaf area to actually absorb that herbicide and provide complete control. And again, one thing to keep in mind, you only actually get true flexibility when you're using stacked soybean traits. If you're using a single herbicide resistance trait, you don't really have a lot of flexibility for your post-emergence application. You're going to be spraying a single effective mode of action time after time. So try to use one of those soybean traits that are stacked, which allow you to spray multiple effective modes of action with your post application. Also, effective weed control is not automatic. It's not because you purchase that soybean trait that you're going to have effective weed control. You got to make sure you use the right herbicides at the right time with the appropriate herbicide application technology. It's not because you're growing the right trait that you're going to have good control. You also got to keep in mind what other non-chemical methods for weed control are best for you in your particular situation. That's more than you can do than just applying herbicides to keep those weeds under control. So when we think about the different technologies that we have available for battling weeds, we may think that we have a lot of options just based on the different herbicide tolerance traits that we have out there in the market. But if we really take a close look at them, as you can see in all these different soybean traits here, we can use Liberty as a post-emergence. Also, in 3 of them, we're still using glyphosate as a post-emergence herbicide. And for enlist soybeans, we're using an auxin herbicide 2,4-D, and we're also using a different auxin for XtendFlex soybeans, which is dicamba. So if you really think about it, we're only limited to a couple of different post-emergence herbicides in all these different soybean traits. So we're not really doing a herbicide mode of action rotation by using different soybean traits, at least not to the extent that we would like to see. So we got to think about other different weed management strategies that we can use, such as mechanical practices such as tillage, other cultural practices such as cover crops, electrocution, and even the weed seed destructor. So there are several different technologies that being adapted for use for weed control, and we gotta keep in mind that all the current and future technologies that we have will require an integrated program approach. None of these technologies by themselves is gonna be sufficient to take care of all of our weed problems. And now to wrap up my presentation, we have several different resources available at Purdue. If you have any questions, we have a website, Facebook page, YouTube channel, and you can also reach out to us by email and phone number anytime if you have any questions. So thanks for paying attention, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Alrighty. Let me get rid of this screen and then I will get my other slides open. Alrighty. So like I mentioned, I thought that would be a nice segue to talk a little bit about identifying a herbicide injury in soybeans. Because especially I know we've been seeing some carryover issue because of, you know, maybe applications on cool, wet soils, maybe they're poorly drained, or, you know, heavier soils or whatnot, causing those carryover issues. There's lots of things that can cause that, but I know there's been some conversation about seeing more carryover issues, and it's just been because of some of the years that we've had. Hopefully next year we won't, you know, see that as an issue, but again, thought it'd be good to discuss it. So I will go ahead and share my screen again. And hopefully maximize it there. Alrighty. So if you guys have any questions during my presentation, feel free to shout something out, and I'll try and check the chat box, but realistically, I probably will forget about it until the end. So I will capture those at the end, unless Hans shouts them out or he sees them. So we'll go ahead and get started. And so we'll just talk a little bit about some different modes of action families here, and we'll kind of go in this order this evening. And talk a little bit about some of them. And of course, we're going to focus a lot on growth regulators just because, you know, obviously we're seeing more growth regulators being used in soybeans that are, you know, don't have the resistance to those growth regulators. Definitely can show a lot of symptoms, and they're just very expressive with their symptoms. And then we'll, like I said, we'll go through the rest of them as well, because we do see quite a few of these and again, it kind of depends on the year, right? And when these were applied in the previous crop. So it kind of oscillates when we see the symptomology. And I guess I'll also want to do a shout out to that. Again, these will be just pointers on how to ID some of these herbicide injury symptoms. But again, there's a lot of disease and just environmental issues that might look similar. So it's always good, you know, to, you know, make sure to get those samples tested and not just assume it's herbicide. Because again, a lot of times, you know, getting a wet year, it could be some seedling disease and not a seedling growth inhibitor. So just as an example, and there, like I said, there's just a lot of other environmental factors that can play into that. So whether it's too dry, too wet, too this, too that, crusting, you know, whatever, there could be a lot of other factors involved. And honestly, a lot of times when we do see, you know, herbicide carryover, we do see multiple things. So it might be a little bit of herbicide coupled with crusted soils, or, you know, or a rooting disease, or something like that. So again, a lot of times it's kind of multifaceted, but we'll just talk about the herbicides specifically tonight. So we'll get started with the growth regulators. So some of the common ones are, you know, Banville, Clarity, Distinct, 2,4-D, and then of course, you know, all the different formulations, whether you have the, you know, Extend or Enlist or whatever, you know, all those products as well that blend in here. And as everybody on this call is well aware, you know, volatility is definitely one one big factor, of course, just off target movement if it's too windy, tank contamination, because again, this stuff can definitely, hide in odd locations, whether it's in your booms or at the ends of the booms or in the nozzle bodies or in your tank or whatever. They can linger a little bit, and so again, definitely can you can accidentally self-impose some herbicide injury too, which again, we see that quite a bit as well. So we'll go ahead and get started with some more the symptomology with these. And I wanted to first start out by talking about this publication, which is relatively new, that it came out in 2019. And so it's really nice pictures differentiating 2,4-D and dicamba injury, specifically on, soybeans. And so a lot of the pictures I'm using and some of the tables I'm using are from this publication. I have the link here. It is a free download, or you can buy the actual publication. I think it's like $5 or something, $5.50, something like that. But it is a free download as well. And if you have questions with accessing that, Hans and I can get that to you later as well. All righty. So looking specifically at 2,4-D symptoms, with 2,4-D, we'll see this callus formation on stems. And here, let me do a laser pointer here. I don't know if that shows up a little bit better on the screen, but the callus formation can form on these stems. And so again, it's just like a callus that you see kind of like on your foot or wherever, or your hands. Kind of a similar kind of concept. It's just this this excess tissue here. Leaf strapping is another one, and basically what this is these leaves get real long and kind of skinny, and those veins look almost like they're parallel because it's just like stretching that leaf out. So it's just getting real stretched out. Again, common with 2,4-D. And then this stem twisting, also referred to as epinasty. A lot of times you'll see them also talk about epinasty if you're reading different articles or things like that. Again, it's just a kind of a fancy phrase for this stem twisting. In this slide, you can see it's kind of bent over here, but sometimes depending on the rate and just the susceptibility of the variety of soybean, I mean, this can really get curled up and really twist really well. Now, like I said, with some of these herbicides, soybean varieties vary a lot on how they react. And so again, you might not see any stem twisting, but you'll just see the leaf strapping, or, you might see one symptom, maybe not necessarily all of them. And again, all the varieties you'll see similar symptoms, but just, again, depending on the rate, the variety, etc., they might be either a little more severe or less severe than other times. All right, so looking at dicamba symptoms, one of the main symptom is this leaf cupping on these young leaves here. You can really see that leaf cupping. And when you look across the field, if a whole field is impacted, or, even, if 50 acres out of a 100-acre field or something's impacted, you can look across there and you can see this. And a lot of times when it cups up like this, that leaf, that tip of that leaf right there kind of has more of a white appearance. And again, that kind of makes it more noticeable, especially if you're looking across this field. You can kind of see it's kind of got that white look, as well as you can tell there's something going on with the top leaves on that soybean crop. If there's a high drift scenario where it's just a higher rate of dicamba, it can also kill this apical meristem, or this meristem at the very top of the plant. And so that's definitely no good, because that's just, like I said, that's a high rate, and it can kill out that top of that plant, and that's just no good there. So I'm going to move on to looking at a little bit of, again, this is a graph in that publication that I mentioned before. And so this lists the symptom, and then it talks about dicamba or 2,4-D. And so again, you can see the kind of what we discussed earlier. It also includes height reduction, which again, sometimes, can see some height reductions with both dicamba and 2,4-D. Typically with 2,4-D damage, we'll talk a little bit about this in the next slide, but it just takes a higher rate of 2,4-D to cause more symptoms. So a lot of times it'll say just high rates, and it's because it just takes a higher rate of 2,4-D usually to cause damage. Again, we can see some of that, like I said, that apical meristem or that meristem right on the top of the plant can die back. And then, yeah, we can just see some differences in nodes and the number of nodes being produced, because again, they are growth regulators. So again, it's impacting how that plant is growing. So we do see some of these other odd characteristics as well. All right, so looking at soybean yield losses from dicamba, again, it's hard to tell, and it's really hard to predict this, because I know, we get crop insurance agents and folks that call and they're asking for help with this. And again, it's definitely hard to be able to predict. And that, that's always tough for, not only whoever's doing the crop adjusting, but also, for the person that had drift damage or, all parties involved. It can just be very frustrating, but you can kind of look at this table though, just to get kind of an idea of from some of the trials that were conducted. And so this is soybean injury 14 days after treatment. And then it also talks about the yield reduction in response to both 2,4-D and dicamba. And so you can see we have a non-treated plot here at the very top, and you can see that at the end, the yield for those soybeans was right around 56 bushel per acre. So again, that's what we're kind of comparing this against. And then we have the dicamba and the 2,4-D, and then here's the rates. And so again, we have kind of these higher rates, 10% of a kind of standard rate, and then 1%, and then it goes down into, less than 1% here. And then we can see the injury at vegetative growth stage 2, and then which is 2 trifoliates, and then reproductive stage 1 where those flowers are starting to come out. So again, you can see that a lot of times, we can see we can see some dicamba injury even at low rates. So that's kind of one of the take-home messages again, is that low rates can cause more injury versus looking at the 2,4-D. And then also with the dicamba, especially if plants get injured at these reproductive phases, we tend to see more yield reduction than if it gets some dicamba injury at these V2 stages. And so, I know there's been questions about when the cutoff date in Indiana is going to be for 2021 for application of dicamba. And I know last year it was June 20th. And the reason behind that June 20th was just to try and minimize the drift on these reproductive phases to just reduce the amount of damage altogether, and especially yield loss. So again, this is some of the research that went into some kind of factoring in that date. And so again, if you're curious about where they're coming up with that date, it's because they've kind of factored in where our soybean growth stages are at what times of the year. So again, you can find this in that publication that I mentioned before. If you want to actually sit down and study it in more detail, by all means, go ahead and look at it. All right, so kind of finishing out our growth regulators, we also have 2,4-D-B, which is Butarac. And honestly, I don't know if anybody really sprays 2,4-D-B. It's kind of I don't even know if anybody sells it, honestly. So I'd be interested to know, because it can be kind of hard to find. You can find it here and there, I guess. But again, it's a growth regulator. You can find, it's supposed to be safer on soybeans, but you can still get some symptomology on them. And depending on the year and the variety, et cetera, it can be worse or not as bad. I know there were we did some trials, and it was interesting because we were seeing more damage with 2,4-D-B than what we were seeing with 2,4-D. So it was very interesting. Like I said, I think it just kind of depends on the year and everything. But again, you can kind of see this crinkled leaves, maybe a little bit of strapping, and then parallel veins and stuff. So again, it's going to be similar symptomology to the other growth regulators. Again, they've been able to find some 2,4-DB damage and yield reduction in some of the research locations. And so again, it's just a pointer that, just be careful with it, because I know it does have a label, or it had a label. Again, I don't know if anybody really sprays a whole lot of it anymore. So then we're going to move into the amino acid synthesis inhibitors, and we'll start with the ALS inhibitors, especially because we tend to see some carryover issues with some of the ALS products. Can see some tank contamination, some drift issues, can see a little bit of everything. And so this first is some tank contamination with accent. We'll talk a little bit more about accent later. So I won't get too carried away on this slide. And then we have some lightning tank contamination. So again, can see tank contamination with that. We can also, again, like I said, we can see carryover issues. It can lead into stunted plants, or even, reduced populations if it happens to kill some of them. But oftentimes it's kind of this real ununiform look. Definitely stunts the plant, kind of makes it kind of this weird shrubby look. The ALS inhibitors will cause this red veins, and if you look at the back side of the leaf, you'll see some of the red veins, but I'll talk a lot about that a little bit more. The one thing with these ALS is that they can move through the xylem and phloem in the plant, so they are kind of moving throughout the plant too, as it's injuring it. So again, I made a comment, we'll go back to accent, which the active ingredient is nickel sulfuron. And so basically we typically apply accent to corn to control grass species. So it is typically, again, like I said, it's a corn herbicide, typically to control grasses. Again, it's systemic, so it is moving up and down in the plant in that xylem and phloem. And as I mentioned, you can see this red venation. If you flip the soybean leaf over, this is a pretty telltale sign that you have an ALS injury. So again, pretty much all the ALSs can cause this, especially if they're not labeled on soybean. And again, sometimes all the veins are really bright red. Sometimes they're kind of more of a purple color. So again, it kind of depends on how long it's been, how old of injury you're seeing, and then also, just kind of the characteristics of that soybean plant, how it's reacting. So definitely common signs, see it about everywhere, but it can also cause kind of this yellowing. And so again, you can see that it's, yellowing. If you flip some of these leaves over, you might see some of that red venation also on the bottom of those leaves. Alrighty. So continue with the amino acid synthesis inhibitors. So glyphosate actually lands on this. So that's all your Roundup, Touchdown, Glyphomax, all those products. And again, this, the common symptomology is this top leaf, or these young leaves will be real yellow. They might turn brown and die and kind of fall off about 10 to 14 days after treatment. Sometimes they can also resemble like a potassium deficiency, maybe something caused by soybean cyst nematode, something like that. So a lot of times it might look like other symptoms. So like I mentioned before, it'll be important to, make sure, double check if, how long ago was it that you had a soil test? You need to do another one, you need to check maybe that pH, or check your potassium level in that soil, do an SCN test, because again, I know our populations are kind of getting resistant, or they're changing, and so they're, the typical resistance that we have in our soybean population right now is that with the PIA 8788. And so it's kind of breaking down. And so we are starting to see, again, soybean cyst nematode issues on varieties that we might not normally see it on. So again, lots of it, could be a lot of things, could be a blend of things. So just understand, but again, glyphosate, very common to have that yellow kind of top leaf, kind of that flashing, so to speak. Again, some just more glyphosate injury, and this injury kind of causes this mottled look too. So sometimes it can cause more of a mottled look. Sometimes the whole leaf's yellow. Again, just depends. It can change a little bit depending on the year and weather and everything else. So moving on to looking at some Liberty damage. So again, if you accidentally spray, in the a dicamba bean with Liberty or something like that, this is what you'll be looking for. So Liberty, we typically classify as a contact herbicide. It moves a little in the plant, not much. It tends to just where it hits, it stays. Typically, the older leaves are most impacted. Causes this chlorosis or yellowing, and usually with Liberty, it's kind of an orangey color. Also, again, kind of a like more of a nitrogen deficiency type. I don't know. It's kind of an orangey yellow color. So a lot of times we'll see the chlorosis or the yellowing, and then wilting within about 3 to 5 days after application. And then this necrosis or the dead spots will start about 1 to 2 weeks. And so with Liberty, again, if you've sprayed Liberty before, you've probably noticed if it's a real bright sunny day, if you have high humidity, moist soils, it can really speed up the activity of Liberty. So again, it can also impact the injury and kind of speed up the intensity of the injury if it's accidentally on a sensitive soybean plant. All right, we're going to move into seedling growth inhibitors, which again, I don't know, a few folks use these. The main problem with these, especially the prowl and troughland, is you have to incorporate them. So unless you want, if you want to run tillage, or if you have a center pivot and you can incorporate it with water or whatever, you can do it that way. It seems like it's always kind of sporadic, especially with the tillage. I know we hand raked plots with some of these products sometimes, and you get hot spots and then you get spots that it didn't look like you sprayed anything. So sometimes the incorporation can be a little finicky. Or maybe it was just my raking ability wasn't that great. But anyway, it can be a little bit of a struggle to incorporate those. And I know, like I said, a lot of folks have kind of moved away from these. But again, what these tend to cause is stunted plants or plants that don't fully emerge. They might have these real short, kind of thicker root systems on them. This hypocotyl right here, it usually can be swollen. It can get kind of cracked. It can also kind of get a calloused material, kind of calloused up as well right through here. And this one kind of looks like it might be a little more calloused. And usually the callousing can be kind of right around that soil surface. And so a lot of times these can also cause some lodging issues. So, obviously if it's calloused and just getting real brittle at the soil surface, it can lead to other disease issues coming in and again, cause some lodging issues. All right, oops, I need to move this. All righty, so then looking at some seedling growth inhibitors, that includes things like dual lasso, some outlook boundary, things like that. A real classic symptom in this is that this mid vein will basically be stunted. And so it caused what we call this jaw stringing appearance. So think as if you have, your sweatpants or whatever, and you're pulling that drawstring. That's kind of what it's doing in this case at the tip of this leaf. It's causing that drawstringing appearance where it's kind of pinching it in. Also, these leaves can be real crinkly. And again, you can see here too, again, the symptomology might be a little different. It might not be as crinkled, or the drawstringing might not be as exaggerated. Again, it's kind of, the symptomology can kind of range a little bit, but that's a pretty classic, again, symptom of those seedling growth inhibitors. When we look at soybean loss from these seedling growth inhibitors, typically it is fairly rare that we see any, like I said, yield loss. It could be possible if you actually start losing a bunch of, your soybean stand and you get down to less than 80,000 plants per acre, then you could be, obviously seeing some yield loss. And again, it depends on the ground and, just the productivity of the soil that you have to, on if it'll really reduce how much it'll reduce your yields. So again, typically you might see some of that symptomology, but usually it grows out of it fairly quickly. Looking at photosynthesis, photosynthesis inhibitor. So it's basically what it sounds like. It's inhibiting that photosynthesis. Atrazine is a classic one that we'll see. And a lot of times it starts with just yellowing of these leaf margins. And then basically they'll go necrotic, or that, that tissue will die. And you can see that in here. Tends to affect older, larger leaves first, and then moves through the plant. And we'll talk about it a little bit more here. So again, looking at atrazine in a little bit more detail. Again, obviously it's safe on corn, pretty much all the grass crops, and is, it is a restricted use pesticide. So you have to have your private applicator license to apply it. And it's because it can be fairly persistent in soils. And again, depending on those soils, the weather, the varieties that are out there, this all kind of changes that, it can be a little different. So again, with atrazine, again, you can see some of this intraveinal chlorosis as well with it. Again, it's usually on those older leaves. And so the intraveinal chlorosis, so again, you're looking in between these veins and it's turning yellow. And then ultimately what will happen is it'll die and turn necrotic, or, die. And again, it'll die in between the veins, and the veins might still stay kind of green. But again, that's a fairly common symptom, again, with atrazine. And then ultimately, basically, if it's severe enough, then these leaves will dry up and fall off. Okay, so that's hopefully don't have that much drift to where it's, causing that much death. But again, it definitely is a possibility. All right, continuing on with cell membrane disruptors. So we'll start with the soil applied ones, and then we'll go to the post applied ones. And let me check my time real quick. Okay. And so Spartan, Valor, Authority, those products, we'll see this in. Again, we'll see plant stunting. We'll see stem lesions, and it's usually like a reddish colored on this hypocotyl area too. The cotyledons can also turn like a reddish brown color. Typically not much, there's no translocation. And sometimes we'll see more injury on poorly drained, wet, cool soils than anywhere else. It can also kill this apical bud, which is not good. And that can cause some other symptomology that we'll talk about a little bit later. Again, looking at yield loss from cell membrane disruptors, again, more varieties are more sensitive to sulfentrazone and flumioxazin than others. And so it's kind of an unknown on that. And again, in sensitive varieties, the weather really impacts that. And again, your soils, it can really impact it if there's that yield loss. And again, those cool, wet soils can really impact that. So looking at post-applied products, if you guys have ever sprayed Cobra in soybeans, you guys know exactly what these cell membrane disruptors do post. I always tell folks, I did a Cobra study with one of our growers here when I first started in Knox County, and I told him, I was like, just please promise me don't go out to this field for, at least 2 weeks. Well, guess what? He went out after week 1 and he's like, you killed my soybeans. And I'm like, no, they'll come back. Calm down. It's okay. They'll come back, because they'll basically go sometimes, and again, it depends on the variety and the year and the temperature, but sometimes like it'll just look like brown sticks out there, and it's like, oh no. And you're just crossing your fingers hoping they'll bounce back, and typically they do. Like I said, sometimes the rare occasions where weather is really that bad to where they do die, but they do look pretty bad. But you see this speckling, again, real common, again, stunting. If crop oil is used and, extremely cool, warm temperatures can increase plant injury. And again, if that apical bud is injured, it can also cause these malformed leaves and kind of this puckering and disfigured leaf as well. All right. So gramoxone, so this is a paraquat. So again, can have some water soaked lesions on this, followed by some red ring lesions and speckling. And this speckling is really common, and red ring lesions is really common on drift. So field edges and stuff like that, that's a pretty common symptom. Going into the pigment inhibitors, or those HPPD inhibitors like mentioned in the previous session, I'm looking at balance. Again, we call these pigment inhibitors, I call them bleachers, because a lot of times these will be just white. It'll look like it snowed in June or July because it's just white. But it also can just be a subtle yellowing. And young new leaves are usually the ones that are the whitest, or like on field edges, you'll see a lot of that. And then eventually it'll die. So here's another one with Callisto is pre, and you can see that white a little bit better. Again, this kind of bronzing, this whitish streaking kind of in here. And again, this will probably eventually die off too. Alrighty, so those are the main ones. And I think we're right about on time. Looks like about a minute or two. We do have a survey here for you this evening, and I think Hans was going to put it in the chat box as well. It's this tinyurl.com, and it's just FWW for Farm Winter Workshops, and then weeds for this session. So if you don't mind going there, and I think Hans just dropped it in the chat box if I'm right. Oh, yep. So he put it in the chat box, so you can just directly click on that. Hans, I know you're recording that. Are you going to use their emails from the survey also to send them the links to that, or how are you wanting to work that? I'll let you give any other details that if you want to share.
Sure. So for the survey, please do fill that out. I don't know that we have, well, for those on tonight, I know all of you. I have all of your email addresses, but probably won't follow up via email per se, just to respect you all and your voluntary nature of the survey. But yeah, if you would fill that out, we'd appreciate it. And then happy to take any questions at this time or comments from the group.